David, this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. You're David Pinsoff.
I'm your Dave Pietraszewski. You stole my
And this
thunder
is
there.
Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, actual evolutionary psychology by.
By actual evolutionary psychologists.
Today we have Jenn Byrd-Craven. She is at the intersection scientifically of the mind and the endocrine system, and that is what we talked about today.
Yeah, we talked all about the nuances of stress and cortisol and what it does to the mind and body and the evolutionary origins of stress, its functions. This was a big learning experience for me. I feel like I learned a lot about how stress works, how the endocrine system works.
Yeah, why do
Um,
we need an endocrine system? Why do we need a brain? Why do we have stress? Why is it bad? Why does it feel bad? Is it all bad? All these things. And yeah, I certainly learned a lot too. I feel like this is some of these episodes we are experts, and some I feel like we're bumbling idiots. And I actually really enjoy the latter category because I learn a lot, and I feel like this was that latter category for me at least.
Totally. Yeah, it was great to just expand my knowledge on a hugely important topic, which is stress. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so if you feel stressed or not at all, and if you have opinions about stress or know somebody who is stressed or wants to be less stressed, or does anybody want to be more stressed?
maybe some people they're just too chill and they got to figure this
Actually,
shit. I don't know.
I wanted to ask Jen. Jen, if you're listening, I forgot to wanted to ask you, is there anybody who doesn't have stress? Like there's people who are born without pain. I wonder if
Hmm.
there's people who are born without stress, and I wonder what that does.
Yeah, that would be fascinating to
Yeah.
look at.
Oh,
Yeah, I have no
well, we
idea.
can circle back to that. Maybe we can have Jen back on, or we can get somebody in the comments saying, I don't
Yeah,
have stress, and here's what my life is like.
yeah. Well, kick back, relax, avoid activating your stress response, and enjoy this episode with Jenn Byrd-Craven.
As I understand it, you study not only psychology, but something called the endocrine system.
I do.
Um, we really haven't had an endocrine person on. We've
Mhm.
sort of touched on it very lightly, but what is that and why do we have it instead of just a brain?
Right. That's a great question, actually. So the endocrine system is super old. We share it with, almost all other vertebrates and things like that. And it essentially works alongside neurotransmitters and things like that to motivate our behavior. And so I'm interested in, sort of what motivates us and how can we sort of assess that. And the endocrine system is a beautiful system to be able to tell us what organisms are prioritizing in the moment. And it's also a ton easier to measure than brain activity and things like that. So.
Do you feel like people who study the mind from a computational perspective overlook the motivation and embodiment element? Because I've noticed as we sort of have technology and computing technology, it really emphasizes the information processing part of the picture, but then it almost makes everything else feel like magic.
Right.
Have you noticed this at all or come up against this?
I have a little bit, particularly in like in reviews and things
Mhm.
like that. When we send things to more general journals, it's it comes up and also just even in teaching and things like that too with other students and that sort of thing. So and it is really sort of people don't, in my opinion, I'm biased, but they don't pay enough attention to these sort of older systems that are informing these newer information processing systems.
So we're taking a brain-centric perspective, and really the endocrine system got there first in a way, or
Mhm.
maybe
Yeah.
as a way of putting it. Okay.
Right. Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
interesting. I mean, I have a deeper question. It's okay if you don't know the answer to it, but it seems like a brain naively would be enough. Like if you need to motivate behavior, you
Mhm.
have neurons, they're connected to our muscles, they're connected to our hearts, they're connected
Mhm.
to our lungs. They can send a message to say, hey, get going. Uh, you know,
Mhm.
make the heart go faster, make the muscles tense up, get out of that situation. Seems like the brain is enough. Why do you need this whole complicated endocrine system?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And it's important to remember that a lot of this starts in the brain. And so, like, the hypothalamus, pituitary glands, and things like that. We tend to think of, like, puberty is a great example. We tend to think of puberty on the level of the gonads, right? That's not what's happening. It's the pituitary that's signaling down to the gonads to start producing their stuff. And so I think that, having it integrated with the limbic system and things like that allows you to, sort of be more flexible in your behavior, perhaps. But it's also, you remember, brains are expensive. Right. And so if we could sort of, have this on a, sort of more simple level, then that might, sort of solve the problem without having to recruit the brain. It's really when we, sort of run up against challenges that we can't, sort of just operate on the autonomic nervous system anyway, that we then start recruiting higher processes.
Can I ask too, like, if I think about from the perspective of development, development is a chemical soup process where genes are contingently
Mhm,
orchestrating
mhm.
the building of stuff. Um, is it that, the brain is sort of neurochemical and can change the structure? So like, if electricity is in the right place at the right time, that can cause chemical changes and structural changes. But is the idea that the endocrine system is sort of like analogous to development, that it can do a better job of continuing development, right? Like, I mean, I think people, I have a cartoonish view of development as like, once you're sort of an adult, you're done developing, but that's not an adaptationist way to think about the
Right.
contingent building of the phenotype.
Mhm.
Is that also true that the endocrine system is sort of this ontogenetic developmental chemical building process? Is that a metaphor that's appropriate or not?
Yeah, I think so. And it stimulates gene expression or not, can silence genes, and that sort of thing. And so even prenatally, one of the system that I'm most familiar with and I work with the most is the HPA axis, right? And so that can actually modify based on mother stress levels, can
Mm.
modify fetuses, gene expression in a number of different areas, metabolism, just, essential stress response, and things like that. And then that process just sort of continues across development. Obviously, with puberty being sort of this massive reorganization, and, sort of sensitive period of that, then you have, a lot of these endocrine systems sort of recruiting higher level processes to be able to coordinate behavior and, adapt.
Yeah, stress sounds really interesting, and I'm sure we're going to get into that. I have another dumb question, um, which maybe I'll again like to with David's caveat of like if we don't, if this is a too big question, but why do we have puberty? Like why don't we just build the adults? Why do we have extended childhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. And humans are unique in that we have a period of childhood that the other apes don't have. They just go from infancy to juvenile period to adulthood, and then you also have adolescence is unique among humans, and particularly that growth period and things like that. And so I think that just drawing from like Barry Boggin's work and some other things, childhood essentially is a feeding adaptation, right?
Hmm.
And to be able to, sort of free mother up from lactation and things like that, that frees her up to produce other offspring. And then you sort of outsource that, care of that little, immature to, fathers, grandparents, aunts and uncles, others in their community, and that sort of thing. And during that time, they're learning about the social environment. And humans are, as you guys know, just incredibly complex. And our culture and, even social groups change so quickly from generation to generation that you can't really have a system that's very static. And, from the beginning, you need to have a system that's plastic and able to sort of modify these neural systems according to the appropriate context.
So is it um, that building sort of a complete sexually mature adult right at childhood would be too costly in terms of energy, and that if you're a baby, you want to be uh, as you don't want to be too demanding of
Mhm.
your uh, parents' time and energy. And if you had complicated sexual equipment to maintain, that would just be an extra drain on your family. And you want to try to be as cost effective as possible in this early period and save that energy intensive sexual maturation for later when you have perhaps accumulated more embodied capital and you are able to make those expenditures. Is that
Right.
basically the idea?
Yeah, that's essentially the idea. And then it also allows for learning. It allows for, sort of fine-tuning these systems to the particular cultural context, not only learning about technology, but learning about people, how they work, who's aligned with who, kids start tracking status and things like that. And there's some evidence to suggest that that is better, sort of fine-tuned under the protective umbrella of parents and others versus, sort of getting right to it. You might get it wrong. And particularly because, our groups are so incredibly complex socially.
And from a biological perspective, the idea of a morph, which is like a subtype or a version of a body, I guess is
Hmm.
sort of the
Hmm.
broadest way. So I guess the idea is that we have age morphs, and is it that we're are there, I mean, obviously there's like, developmental morphs where there's like a butterfly and a chrysalis and a
Hmm.
caterpillar before the
Hmm.
butterfly. Are our age morphs weird compared to other species?
They are. They're very weird. In that we have a number of unique life history factors. So, I mentioned childhood and adolescence. We also have menopause. So we have,
Mm,
women living 2 to 3 decades longer, past their reproductive periods. What is that about?
yeah.
What is that for? And if you understand childhood in a unique way, you can understand menopause to some extent. So grandmothers that are, sort of helping to provision and also helping to teach these complex social systems. Again, sort of, frees mom up to reproduce again. So, overall reproductive success is higher, and that sort of thing. But it is, it's a beautifully designed system in a lot of ways, but also suggests that our evolutionary history was really strong with social selection. And, those that were, a little bit more savvy and social skills did a lot better.
Yeah. What I'm hearing you say, and just to make explicit maybe for listeners, is that there's been arguments that we our foraging niche is extractive, which is like we make a living. We're not like koala bears where you just eat a
Mhm.
eucalyptus trees,
Right.
leaves, whatever. We extract really difficult high process things like
Mhm.
the process demand things like
Right.
and then also socially we're very arms racy, to put it simply.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so both things sort of are an arms race of ever increasing complexity. So in
Hmm.
some sense, we have a really hard job, and so it requires a lot of help, a lot of
Right.
learning.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that is that a fair sort of summary, or at least
Yeah.
like that's the one. That's sort of why we're complicated, right? Like
Mhm.
we're very biased to think intelligence is a good thing, but in some sense, from a biological perspective, it's very costly
Right.
because of time and energy, and it's really we are we're sort of an unfortunate possibility space in organism space from a Dawkins perspective, in the
Hmm.
sense of we have to be complicated because of the way we make a living, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And, they're just things that don't translate very well in a canalized form from generation to generation. Foraging you mentioned is a great example of that. We forage in a lot of different niches. And, eating the wrong thing could kill you. You
Right.
have to learn how to process, different kinds of foods and things like that. And all that is, happening through this developmental process.
Right. So you can't build into the germline the information about how to make a living. So it's setting up these more open parameter systems. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And you certainly can't build in, sort of, mating systems and, peer networks and, all of those sorts of cultural things.
Yeah.
Is a fruitful way of thinking about this in terms of the economics of energy And the endocrine system is, you can think of them as kind of economic planners of, channeling energy toward particular activities at particular life stages. So when you're in childhood, the best thing you want to do is invest energy in just eating and learning. Like that's your job. And then once you've
Mm.
eaten enough and learned enough, it's time to start competing for mates.
Mhm.
And then you want to channel all the energy into sexually developing and competing for mates and entering, status games, whatever. And then, once you get older, you have kids. You want to channel energy into investing in those kids. For women, if you start to have grandkids, you might want to channel effort away from mating competition and into investing in the grandkids. And behind each of these shifts in energy throughout the lifespan are the endocrine mechanisms
Mhm.
that channel energy allocation in different directions. Is that a fair way of describing the evolutionary logic of it?
Yes, absolutely. That's perfect. And the endocrine system really gives us an idea of how that energy is being distributed and to what
Yeah.
extent, in different domains. So that's why I love it is that it really gives you an idea of, what is motivating that organism in that, particular moment in time.
Yeah. And I remember when I was a kid, I think it was like elementary school, there was like a poster. I have like a very vivid memory of it where it talked about the different stages of life.
Mhm.
And I don't know what source this was, but it was something like the equivalent of like, it was like childhood play, like parenting, be productive. And I remember thinking, how do people know that? Like, I think my implicit like kid model was sort of like maybe I was being blank slatey about it, but I was sort of like, how is it possible? I didn't have the vocabulary to say what I'm going to say now, but what my question was how is it possible that the human lifespan is reliably developing enough that people can predict people's motivations at different times in their life?
Mhm.
And I think that's I imagine scientifically in the history of the sciences that that is a phenomenon to be explained. And I wonder, and maybe this is a getting the segue into how you got into this, but I can imagine one way to approach or how to get into the endocrine system or evolutionary approach to the endocrine system is to look at phenomena like reliably occurring different phases of life and start to ask, well, why would that exist?
Mhm.
Right. And
Mhm.
another way is to sort of say, given an adaptive problem, what might not we be looking for, or what might be missing? And you can kind of do both.
Mhm.
How did you get interested in doing an endocrine informed psychology and marrying
Mhm.
those two from an evolutionary perspective? And maybe this is relevant to the answer, but I'm also curious, sort of in that continuum of phenomenon first versus adaptive problem first.
Mhm.
Along that continuum, how is that informing that broader story of how you got interested in the endocrine system? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I really, came through this through development. Not, a lot of people, sort of come at this through the mating context, right? And they get interested in that. And I think, one of the things that I was really fascinated with as an even undergraduate student is the fact that, like you just mentioned, there is such universals in human development. Language is a perfect example of that. So we're exposed to different languages. Obviously, the output is different. But if you look at kids across the world, they are reliably, their first word comes about, 1 year old. And, all of these things are very reliably sort of patterned and then discovered that this marker of sort of where you're motivated happens to be really found in the endocrine system that you can it's a sort of different than like heart rate and things like that. It's a much more sort of broad measure of sort of where is this individual attending and that sort of thing. So one of the things that and I could sort of explain so some of the work that I've done in my lab, but also related to drawing from other folks. So Laura Stroud is a researcher that does just sort of biopsych type stuff and doesn't really come at it from this sort of more evolutionarily informed perspective. But one of the findings that I was fascinated with early is there's sex differences in, particular, we all get stressed over a lot of the same things, but there's some things that men are much more likely to at least show a stress response on. If you ask them, it's essentially the same, but they show a stress response, and then it's different for women. And what's interesting about this is that different doesn't show up until puberty.
Mm.
So when you do, kids in these paradigms, you don't see any sex differences. All of a sudden, puberty comes in line, and you start seeing these different responses in the stress response system, not in testosterone or estrogen and things like that. So they're attending to different aspects of their social environment. And, a lot of these things are, a lot of times people will say, well, isn't that socialized, right? But it's, we see it pretty reliably developing across different cultures and, replicated across time. So, for example, men are more likely to show a stress response, and boys, adolescent boys, over, these public achievement stressors, right? Anything that can, sort of impact your status publicly, a public performance, you don't do well, that's going to initiate a really nice stress response. Women also show that, and adolescent girls, but not to the extent that men do. Women are much more reactive to social rejection, even very, very subtle forms of social rejection. And so you could, get people in the lab, and you have two Confederates, and they start talking to each other more so than the actual participant. So even that, they're not being rude, they're not, physically rejecting her, and things like that, just this beautiful, nice stress response to that. People do not like it. The men in the situation, again, will show some stress response, but not to the extent. And those things are adaptively patterned. If you think about it, right around, adolescence, what you should be attending to, what men should be attending to, is their public status, their explicit, these status competitions, and things like that. That should motivate their behavior to attend to these things, sort of be able to fix mistakes, and those sorts of things. And the same thing for women. So social rejection has really big consequences starting in adolescence and then in adulthood. And so you should be attending to those things. And again, this motivates you to repair to some extent.
Just to push on the social rejection versus public representation, I'm thinking sort of from a like just off the top of my head, has there been work sort of unpacking what exactly is the representation? Like I maybe not. I mean, because I can think about it sort of as it's all status at a sort of more abstract level. And and I think too, you mentioned that, it's the socialization. There's been like a history of sort of there's been lazy evolutionizing and anti-evolutionizing in the past where it's sort of like, well, here's a behavior, is it learned or innate, right? And I think that we're all doing the more complicated second wave thing of sort of there's some evolved representations and there might be sex differences or even not about certain things being more problematic or putting more motivation behind, or this is sort of the North Star of the control system, you know? And so I'm just wondering, like, they sound both like status, and I actually can't even
Yeah.
tell apart maybe it's sort of like a common knowledge versus I don't actually can't even reverse engineer exactly what's different between like I intuitively I get public status
Mhm.
versus social rejection,
Mhm.
but I couldn't tell you what the robotic software level difference between those two things are. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And you actually bring up a really great point is that they are both status. It's just, sort of, how we in psychology are used to measuring status versus not. So we're not really, used to having this more evolutionarily informed aspect of like, status for women is, sort of this social acceptance and sort of, how you're valued in the group. Same thing for men. It just is expressed, quite differently. And so these stressors that I was talking about are more like achievement stressors. So as an example, participant comes in and they're asked to solve an unsolvable math problem or memorize a, difficult passage like Paradise Lost or something like that, and then repeat it to the experimenter. And then they see a Confederate do quite well. So they're outperformed essentially. And I think, particularly for like skills, You want to demonstrate that you're a skilled member of your coalition, a valued, and potentially valued member of your coalition. And what that does is that just very publicly says, no, you're not. That's a great point, and that they're really both status.
I
Um,
see.
it's just how it's
Yeah.
expressed.
And also, I guess it would be an opportunity for like aggression. Like,
Hmm.
because I also think like sometimes male aggression is sort of oafish in
Hmm.
public, right? Or it's sort of like, oh, you're stupid, right? Like,
Hmm.
and yeah, so it's interesting, but it's interesting, yeah, like the burden would be to sort of unpack exactly what the representation is. I'm guessing we're going to bump up against that a lot because I imagine, because I would also like to ask about stress, is a lot of the constructs you've inherited and we've all inherited are not coming from an adaptationist or even selection pressure or adaptive
Absolutely.
problem first.
Hmm.
And there's often sort of a instinct blindness or
Hmm.
essentialism
Hmm.
about it, where it's intuitive, but that's a problem because then we don't really unpack what it is.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, is that you're saying yes? Is that
Absolutely, yeah. And that much more so, obviously, in sort of mainstream psychology than in our field, we think a little bit differently about things. But yeah, that's one thing that I come across a lot.
okay? I mean, maybe then this is a lead into then what is stress, or is it even a thing? Um, and it's an intuitive and obvious, and we all experience it. But then, yes, can you disabuse us of the instinct blindness of stress?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you bring a good point in that oftentimes we're really poor reporters of our own stress. There's a lot of things that are happening sort of underneath the hood, so to speak, that we're not aware of. And Adolescents in particular are really horrible reporters of sort of how stressed do you feel, rated on 1 to 10, that sort of thing.
In terms of being bad at reporting this, are you talking to about a disconnect between self-reports of how stressed a person is versus a physiological response,
Yes.
such that a person might say that they're not very stressed, but physiologically they're revealing indicators of stress. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. More
Okay.
commonly, it's the other way around. So
Oh,
they'll say,
interesting.
like, I'm very stressed, and then you don't really see any physiological indicator of that. So,
Huh, interesting.
yeah, yeah. But to answer your question of what is stress, you can go way back to Hans Selye and things like that, and essentially when the demands exceed the resources, you're going to experience sort of a disruption in homeostasis and that sort of thing. So that basic definition is actually really useful to build on. Obviously humans are much more complex than that, but that's sort of the foundation that I you go from. And it's also important to sort of differentiate the two different stress responses, so the autonomic nervous system versus the HPA axis. So autonomic nervous system more into the sort of current stress, acute stress. The HPA axis is more recruited when that doesn't work. You're experiencing a stressor and whatever you're doing, maybe what you did last time isn't working this time. And so then you recruit this sort of more expensive system that's going to produce cortisol that is associated with sort of reorganizing neural networks. And so to some extent, I really don't like the word stress because a lot of times what we're measuring is more like arousal, attention, focus, those sorts of things, not necessarily, sort of the what lay people perceive as stress.
Could you have, in theory, a positively valenced stress, such
Absolutely.
that maybe you found a really great mate and you're
Hmm.
really excited and you can't stop thinking about the person,
Hmm.
and it just fills you with energy.
Yep.
Would that be a kind of stress, and would it show up physiologically as a
Yes.
stress response?
It does. It sure does.
Interesting.
So yeah, those people that are in the early stages of a romantic love when they're interacting with their partner, they show a pretty nice stress response.
Hmm.
Also, kids, for example, like the day before Christmas, right? They might be, there's, anticipating this great event and that sort of thing. A lot of times they'll show pretty high cortisol levels, but they're happy. The
Hmm.
affect is excitement and that sort of thing.
That's fascinating. I mean, it suggests one way in which our intuitive notion, our full concept of stress is wrong in many ways, that it
Right.
doesn't necessarily always need to be negative. What it is basically the body mobilizing energy to deal with
Mhm.
something. And it could
Mhm.
be mobilizing energy to deal with a bad thing or a good thing.
Right.
Um, that's really
That's
interesting.
it's kind of magical. I mean, in a way that it's obvious when because we experience it, but it's sort of a system that's saying like it's predicting based on informational cues in many cases. It's detecting a situation
Mhm.
and then it's creating and planning for future responses and somehow knows what is more likely to be needed in the future.
Mhm.
That's just sort of a magical thing, right?
Yeah, yeah, it is. And it's, sort of again happening all, on the level with the brain, to some extent. But yeah, and it's interesting in a way that the HPA axis and cortisol in particular, the function of it is not necessarily, I mean, it does definitely mobilize, resources and energy, and things like that. It's also associated with destabilization of neural networks, particularly if you're under chronic stress. And that, a lot of times in sort of mainstream psychology, they say, oh no, the stress response system is dysregulated. We need to fix this. It's actually an adaptive process because
Yeah.
what the cues that are coming in is what you're doing isn't working.
Yeah.
Change.
Mm.
Find some different neural networks, find some different ways of approaching the situation.
Yeah, I think one of
Yeah.
the themes of this podcast has been respecting phenomena, and this sounds very much like to almost channel David here. Like stress is bad, right? Like it's bad stuff. We don't want bad stuff, and so anything associated with stress so deregulation, it sounds bad, right? It sounds
Mhm.
like tangle or something.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
yeah, it sounds like what I'm hearing you saying is that we should appreciate not only is it sort of not just in too many negatives, not only is it maybe not just entropic, it might be smart. And we
Mhm.
should at least respect and better understand what's going on first
Mhm.
before we sort of in a patronizing way sort of say, well, let's make sure we never get to stress, we never get to
Mhm.
deregulation.
Right, right, absolutely.
So what is going on? Yeah. Or maybe, I mean, maybe that's too broad of a thing. It seems like a lot of your work has been looking at very particular things, which is probably how the systems work. There's no general stress response.
Mhm.
Can you give us maybe an example, and maybe that's part of the story is that maybe you're arguing with people who think stress is general. I don't know. Like, yeah, can you? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I get, most familiar to me is I've done a lot of work with female friends and a paradigm that is trying to mimic sort of a naturalistic, sort of play out that happens a lot with, sort of, and predict this is to some extent, limited to age, but not exactly. So, with what I've focused on in the lab is processes related to co-rumination, for example. So you have friends that are coming together and they're discussing a problem that's outside of the dyad, but that is important to at least one member of the dyad. What is most interesting to me is that the friend whose problem it is not hers will also mount a stress response. And
Mm.
it's actually pretty consistent with her friends. And so what that tells me is what's going on there is part of it is not necessarily only to deal with our own, sort of scenarios, our own challenges, and things like that. It's to some extent to sort of, prioritize another's priorities, if that makes sense. And that what does that do then? That helps bond you to that other person. You become, sort of, loyalty increases, the relationship quality increases, even while the stress response is doing its thing. And so, I think to some extent we can, sort of look at it that way. And it was sort of surprising to some people that both friends mounted a stress response on this. But if you think about it, what you're doing is coordinating, and you're also this is informative to you, right?
Yeah.
Sort of helping your friends solve their particular problem. Maybe you can be faster, more effective at solving that social problem in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting because it reminds me too of, again, this is sort of instinct blindness, where you can imagine a simple model is you only have a real physiological reaction to things that involve you. But then, of course, like, like September 11th, like people have huge cortisol, like super stress response. There's all kinds of, we know in popular culture, there's sort of like, this is a disturbing video. Don't watch it if like we are just swimming in emotional reactions. And arguably, most of our emotional reactions are third party
Mhm.
observations, right? Fortunately, probably. So yeah, that's a really nice point to just sort of disabuse the cartoonish view that sort of the physiological stuff is really just for first person. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's why we enjoy movies, right? That's why we
Yeah.
enjoy, sort of reading stories and things like that, is you're vicariously, sort of going through this with this character without taking the risk
Yeah.
yourself.
So there's
Uh,
a stress response in response to this friend who, so what can you, yeah, so can you kind of continue? What do you think is going on with that stress response? What's that for, even in that particular situation? Yeah.
I think, if you think about it the other way, so for example, you're talking with your friend and your friend is just, sort of apathetic and they're just, looking away. They're not really, sort of engaged. That's not a good ally, right? That's not a good coalition partner, and, that sort of thing. So by showing that you're sort of, you're engaged in this process, you're, sort of trying to unpack this with them, maybe speculate about the causes and consequences of this, system, and things like that. That at least, from some of the measures that we have, it's associated with them feeling closer
Hmm.
afterwards. So they feel it may be, in part a sort of bonding situation. And I mean, and we've all experienced that before. Like if we all experience the same stressor, right? Everybody feels a bit closer together. I was just talking
Hmm.
to my graduate students about that. They're going through their quant sequence together, and they feel very, very bonded now that they're all nice and stressed, and had to do their midterm, and those sorts of things. And so you feel, it's almost like, fitness interdependence, in a lot of ways. You're sort of, showcasing that.
Hmm.
So,
It,
yeah,
it,
go ahead, David.
it seems like what you're saying is I buy this logic of fitness interdependence that if our fates are intertwined, then what's bad for you is bad for me, and what's good for you is good for me. I mean, the simplest example of that would just be with kinship, or what's good for my daughter is good for me. When my daughter's happy, I'm happy. But the same is true with close friends, with close allies.
Mhm.
There's interdependence there. But also, it seems like what you're saying is that part of the stress response may be a kind of costly signaling of interdependence. That if
Yes.
you tell me about your problems and I don't have a stress response and I'm blasé about it and don't really react, I don't really pay attention, I look bored, I shrug it off, that's going to be a really bad sign.
Mhm.
But if I am just as amped up as you are about the thing that you're dealing with and I'm disturbed by it and appear to be having a stress response, then that is a costly and honest signal
Mhm.
that I feel as if we are interdependent and that our fates are intertwined. And in this sense, the cost would be paid in terms of the energy I'm burning to have
Mhm.
this stress response. Is that an accurate way of describing how you're
That's
thinking about it?
perfect.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and so
Cool.
it's a signal that, hey, I'm invested in you. I am your ally, and that's really important, particularly, in some relationships.
Yeah.
If stress is important, why do we feel like stress is bad? Why is it unpleasant to be? I mean, as David pointed out, maybe there's a version of stress that is, like, oh, I'm madly in love and I'm aroused. I mean, I think maybe arousal
Mhm.
is the folk category, right?
Mhm.
Too. So maybe arousal is stress from a
Mhm.
scientific perspective. But anyway, like, why do we have at least half of arousal is quite negative, and we call that
Negatively
stress?
valent.
Why do we experience it as negative if it's so helpful from a functional perspective?
Well, I think if you think about like the emotion of fear, for example, like we don't like fear, we don't want to do, we don't want to be afraid. But it's really important that we have the capacity to do that, right? And it's really important
Hmm.
that, and to some extent, you can look at things like, why do we watch horror movies? Why do we want to make ourselves, we are deliberately scaring ourselves? What is
Hmm.
that about? And I think, and there's individual differences and tolerance for that and, that sort of thing. But I think, what that's showing is just it's a motivational system, and when we are experiencing the more negatively valent stress, that motivates us to, sort of terminate whatever is causing it, or move away from it, or that sort of thing. But it's quite informative.
Is what you're saying that the design itself of the system that's detecting the current state of the system or the organism is not sufficient to deal with the challenge? That detection of the discrepancy creates a the motivation to change that.
Mhm.
It is that it tags that the current state is all of a sudden unpleasant,
Right.
and that's part of the manifestation of all the engaged systems that are moving towards changing. If that makes, I mean, it's very
Yeah.
abstract. I don't know if
Yeah,
that was,
no,
yeah.
no, absolutely. But yeah, it's adaptively calibrating your behavior to the context.
Huh. Do people put them like, I feel like there's also a mismatch thing where if you can avoid stressful situations, it seems like we would be designed to do so, but in an evolutionary environment, the range of sort of stressful situations we can avoid is maybe less, or maybe we have more control now to avoid stressful
Mhm.
situations. Like I'm thinking a good example of this is there's good research on anxiety or stress and kids play, where if you have kids that are avoiding anxiety inducing play or stressful situations like difficult things physically or socially, it can actually backfire and stunt development.
Yes.
Obviously, there's a middle Goldilocks thing.
Hmm.
Like you don't want kids to be, going through barbed wire or
Right.
being bullied to the point of, abuse or something.
Hmm.
But you don't want to cover kids in pillows and just have
Hmm.
them see smiley faces and happy stories all the time either.
Hmm.
So I wonder, is there a mismatch in terms of the controllability of avoiding stress, maybe even for adults that may be unhealthy? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely it is. And I think, adults try to do that for their children, right? And you're right, it does cause problems. And so, from developmental perspective, you want moderate stressors, and you want to experience some stressors that are initially uncontrollable, that then move to the more controllable category. That's really the point, right? As
Mm.
with coping skills and things like that, is this I can't control, but now I can control my reaction to it. I know how to handle it. And kids that don't have those experiences grow up to have overactive stress response systems because it wasn't sort of inoculated during
Mm.
development. And so then they just, they are hyper reactive to literally everything. So parents can, if they bubble wrap their children, they're actually harming them
Mm.
by doing that. And we're starting to see that more and more because of, like you said, our ability to be able to protect and to, sort of control our environments. What we're seeing is that kids are not able to really deal with some of these challenges that they're experiencing, or just normal, typical, not like you were talking about, like bullying and things like that, but just normal, typical, like, how do I respond to that comment from my friend, without getting, sort of upset and looking immature and, that sort of thing.
Right. So
Mm.
sort of this is interesting because it gets into things like autonomy and feelings of efficacy and responsibility, and the system sort of learns, number one, I've learned how to deal with it in this situation. Maybe this situation in an abstracted form will occur again. And then there's the meta thing of, oh, I was stressed. I felt like I couldn't solve a problem. But then I was able to figure it out, right? Or there's so I'm just sort of fleshing out what you've already said, that you sort of inoculate or learn that you can handle situations. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we talked about this a bit in the episode with Colton Scriven, curiosity, and how we sort of learn how to self-regulate the more we expose ourselves to things. And the way I was trying to understand it was there is a challenge in terms of burning the right amount of energy to deal with the challenge that you're facing, and that maybe when there's a lot of uncertainty, and you're dealing with something for the first time, and you don't really know what's going to happen, our body errs on the side of overproducing energy. And then the more we encounter that situation again and again, and we learn more about it and the types of things that are likely to happen, our body gets better at producing the right amount of energy and it's less likely to overproduce. And so what we might intuitively understand that as like learning how to self-regulate. But I think if you go into the nuts and bolts, it's it may be more insightfully viewed as the body learning more and more about this situation, and learning the appropriate level of energy that is needed to deal with this with threat. And in the beginning, it may overproduce, because it's more costly to underproduce than overproduce. But as you learn more and more, you get the balance right. Anyway, that was the sort of hypothesis that we were throwing out with Colton. I'm curious if you find that plausible.
Yeah, yeah, it's very plausible. And it's also related to sort of what I was talking about earlier with cortisol being responsible for destabilization of neural networks, but also reconnection.
Mhm.
And so what on a neural level, what that looks like is now you have this synaptic pathways to be able to quickly and easily, sort of deal with that particular threat. Whereas you didn't before. And had you not had that reaction, you wouldn't have had, the energetic resources to be able to sort of, disconnect those ineffective neural networks and reconnect more effective ones.
Mhm. I want to get your take on something that still puzzles me and that I find kind of mysterious about stress. And it seems to me that stress is kind of poor. Maybe this is an illusion and maybe it really is well designed, or if this is an example of mismatch. But it seems like for a lot of the things that stress us out, we don't really need to burn a lot of energy. And in fact, in many cases, it could be counterproductive to burn a lot of
Mhm,
energy. So if I'm stressed out about a math test that I'm going to take
mhm,
tomorrow, it seems like I don't really need a lot of energy to deal with that challenge. I'm not going to be running a marathon. I'm not going to be fighting with anybody physically.
yep,
All I need to do is just remember the damn information and
mhm,
then regurgitate that information on the test. It seems like, burning a bunch of energy is just not going to help me deal with that
mhm,
challenge. In fact, it could impair my ability to deal with that challenge insofar as it prevents me from sleeping,
mhm,
and actually, retaining and consolidating the information that I've learned, and being cognitively capable the next day.
mhm,
It seems like there are a lot of examples like that where our body is burning a lot of energy to deal with a challenge that is fundamentally cognitive rather than physical. And yet the body is treating it as if it were physical.
mhm,
And to me, that seems kind of maladaptive. It seems like the body should be good at estimating when it's necessary to burn energy and when it isn't. It should be stingy with investments of energy. Am I missing something here? Is there hidden design here that I'm not seeing? Is this an example of mismatch? What is your take on this?
No, I think that's a great point. It's both. To some extent, it is mismatch. I think, but what you just described is sort of, very consistent with like Sapolsky's view of the human stress response anyway, as being just basically like just overshooting all the time,
Mhm.
and we're, sort of misinterpreting these social situations as being really impactful. I think I would argue that being, sort of, way super stressed over a math test is probably not a great use of your resources. But what we're queuing on are these much more, sort of older sort of perspectives of, the way that others view me is important. And it's important as far as, what skills I'm bringing to the group, how valuable I am as a coalition member. And so these social evaluative sort of threats are, should reliably activate the stress response system. Now, do we overshoot? Absolutely. We do. So we've done a study with students in speech classes, for example. They mount this beautiful stress response and also an immune response to giving a stress in front of their class. Now, nobody, I mean, I haven't heard of anybody, at least at my university, of like, throwing daggers or anything like that at people that either, do well or don't do well, in their speeches. But I think what that's cueing on is this sort of, what others think of me is important, and my performance is important. And so, what the stress response system is doing there is motivating you to prepare, motivating you to better your skill set. So, if you think about, for example, if you weren't stressed about the math test, would you study?
Hmm.
Does this, sort of motivate you towards or away from important outcomes?
Yeah. Uh, I'm gonna make a comment about Robert Sapolsky, but I'm not gonna do that. But what I'm gonna push back against the idea that we're overstressed too much, which is if you imagine, and I don't know if this is true, but if you imagine like the correct design of the system, there's two principles. One is there's sort of an error management perspective where if the whole point of stress is the situations detected where there are not sufficient resources to deal with it, it's necessarily by definition there's a state initially of activating more than had been previously, and that is probably activating more systems than even will be in the future. So for example, I'm learning how to rock climb. The moment I get to a difficult situation, I get really stressed and scared. Now, a lot of that stress and scared response is an error in the sense of when I become a really good rock climber, what that stress and scared response eventually causes me to do is a subset of all the systems that get turned on when I'm initially, as a beginner, scared and stressed. But the issue is, I don't know that yet. And so there is definitionally like a turning on more of many systems. So you would think even just baked into the design, it's going to look overactivated to the extent it's turned on, because the whole point of turning it on is to go through and test,
Mhm.
do we need the system? Yes or no? And
Hmm.
until the job of the stress system is to like wake everybody up in the mind and
Mhm.
sort
Hmm.
of go through and be like, are you going to be useful in this situation? Yes or no?
Mhm.
And the process of waking everybody up is going to look inefficient and overblown
Mhm.
because that's the point, is
Right.
you don't know who's going to be relevant or not. And the
Mhm.
second thing is, and I'm curious what you think about that. And the second thing is, you could also imagine a good design feature would be to scale to the variation. So I think a concrete way to put this would be, yeah, why are kids worried about math tests if they were in combat?
Mhm.
They would think like worrying about the math test would be stupid.
Mhm.
But you would imagine that, yeah, if you put a person in combat, it would rescale to what is the most important thing right now.
Mhm.
But that's a design feature, right? Like it's
Mhm.
like we shouldn't be designed to sort of say, well, what's the range of stress every human on Earth is experiencing, and then I should put myself objectively on that scale.
Mhm.
No, if I'm a rich brat and like the worst thing that can happen to me is like my filet mignon isn't made the way I want it. I mean,
Mhm.
it sucks socially and like morally we can like poo-poo that. But
Right.
like it seems like a well-evolved design system to sort of be like, look at the range of likely things, and then like the things that are the worst, you have that system. Why wouldn't you use that system? So like I actually would push back against that it's a bad design. You can see why people would moralize that, but it strikes me as actually a really good design to sort of just use up the variation that the system is experiencing in that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, I do disagree with Sapolsky on that, that it's, this bad design is perfectly well designed. That's exactly what you would expect is to, like you said, sort of recruit all of these systems in a novel situation. And, when we experience novelty, then that's, sort of all systems go. When it's a more familiar or habituated, sort of context, then, there's less need to sort of, recruit all of these different resources.
Yeah.
But
And I
yeah,
mean,
it's,
I will say, like, as a parent, I'm all the time with my son. I'm like, oh, you don't have to react this strongly. So like, I take
Mhm.
my science
Mhm.
hat off, but
Yeah.
I can see both sides. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But on some to some extent, there, these mismatches do, sort of there's a point there, right? And that, yes, we it's probably adaptive to get at least a little stressed over the math test
Yeah.
because that's going to lead to some important outcomes later. But at the same time, we have the ability now to socially compare ourselves to groups that are, infinitely more larger than in our evolutionary past. And so I think that then sometimes can create a mismatch.
Yeah, I think a lot of advertising or in the marketplace of sort of attention, some people have called this sort of what is like an attention market, where really what's being sought is people's time and attention
Mhm,
now.
mhm, mhm,
That's evolutionarily recurrent stressors
mhm,
are really, as you would expect, really good at capturing attention.
mhm,
Like one thing I always think about is I remember what the Weather Channel used to be like and what it's like now. And
mhm.
like if I look at the Weather Channel website, I'm like convinced that like there's going to be like apocalypse any day now. And 15 years ago it wasn't like that. And I just view that as sort of a result of this market of needing people's attention.
Yeah,
And one could make an argument that a lot of news and a lot of political discourse is
sure.
like that too. So I wonder, I would imagine the stress system or understanding its inputs is actually going to be really important for understanding um, these larger issues of what social representations or content gets public or
Mhm.
people find interesting even.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, don't tell some of those companies that Instagram and things like that. They could definitely recruit,
Oh, they're already doing it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
would think the basic science would correct against it and be like, look,
hmm
they're actually using our endocrine system against us.
hmm hmm
And that's part of why they're doing what they're
Right.
doing. They probably
Yeah.
don't know that they're doing it. They're just A/B testing, right? But
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But that's what, that's and on social media, that's why, sort of, things are sensationalized and this rage, like we pay attention to things that are enraging, right? And why are we doing that to ourselves? It's
yeah,
ridiculous. And a lot of times these are things that don't impact us
yes.
on a day-to-day basis. But we are still, sort of recruiting this absolute rage at these people and spend hours online, arguing with strangers who we'll never meet and will never, sort of have, these interdependent relationships with. But I think it's just the design of the human mind of, when this content is in front of me, so it must be important.
Hmm. It's interesting. I mean, when I think about stress, I usually think about it in terms of its effects on the body.
Mhm.
Your heart races, your muscles tense up, your blood pressure increases. Um, but I haven't, it's hard for me to wrap my head around, the fact that it might also impact the brain.
Mhm.
Um, uh, are there things that the brain can do when it gets a jolt of energy from a stress response that it could not have otherwise done? Does stress change cognition? Does it change neural processing? Is in some ways, do we need energy to cognitively deal with the challenge as well as physically deal with the challenge?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it regulates attention, right? It
Okay.
regulates arousal and attention towards, one stimuli over another. How do you
Mm.
prioritize all the stimuli in your environment?
Yeah.
That's part of what does that overall. So, and yeah, it definitely gets this bad name because a lot of times we have this icky feeling when we feel that way. But again, it's really sort of working with these neural systems to in order to sort of help us attend to things that were recurrently threatening, perhaps, or recurrently rewarding as well. Um,
Yeah. That's
Yeah, I don't know
interesting.
if oh yeah, David, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just curious, like like why the brain needs energy to pay attention?
mhm,
Like in theory, you could imagine the brain just you know turns on the attention networks and focus it on this particular type of information. In theory, that shouldn't require any more energy than being distracted or unfocused.
mhm,
And
mhm.
yet it seems to be related to how energized you are and how focused you are. Is there something about attention that requires energy, or is energy intensive? I mean, just
Mhm.
riffing about it, well, I'm thinking about it right now, like it could be that it takes energy to suppress systems that would otherwise take your attention away. Like, for example, if your stomach is empty and you're hungry, if you're digesting or something, like that could just pull your attention away, and it takes some energy to shut down the that system.
The process,
You know,
yeah.
your cravings, your appetites,
Mhm.
the feelings going on in your stomach, like your digestive system. Like I know stress has effects on appetite and digestion, and it could be that the reason why attention requires energy is because it takes energy to shut things down and suppress them. Do you buy that logic, or is there something else going on in the
No,
relationship between
absolutely.
stress and attention?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You have to inhibit things that are at least in the moment not immediately important, right?
Yeah.
And that does take quite a bit of energy and sort of prefrontal cortex activity to be able to sort of again sort of decide which is a priority. Let's not worry about digestion right now because there's this bear coming or whatever, or
Mm.
I have to give a talk and that sort of thing. So I need to allocate my energy resources. And neural networks cost a lot. They cost a lot of
Yeah.
calories. They're very expensive. So if you just think about it on a sort of cellular level, they're requiring energy to fire, even inhibition. It's not just
Yeah.
excitatory processes, it's inhibitory processes also.
It
It's
might
interesting.
also be the reverse, too, which is that if there's a detection of an important situation, like a bear, or I'm about
Mm.
to give a talk,
Mhm.
there's a lot of energy allocated to like just neck down stuff because it's
Mhm.
important.
Mhm.
But
Mm.
it's that that's co-occurring with then the strong shift down in attention. And the idea is that such a strong shift in it or focus and attention is co-occurring with the detection of such an important situation
Mhm.
that that shutdown and attention is worthwhile, right? So
Mhm.
so it might just be like it's sort of like Rob Kurzban's idea of like why do we have an experience of mental effort? It's not that there's any more calories used up
Right.
by something that feels effortful or not, but there's an opportunity cost, and so that should be detected. So it might be that like we're aware of a real shutdown in attention, like oh my god, I was performing on stage and I wasn't even aware of the crowd,
Mhm.
like I was just in the zone, or like I saw the bear and I didn't even think about what I was doing. Like we have this
Mhm.
experience, but I wonder if it isn't that it is more energetic. It's just that it's only in those situations that are really important, that our evolved psychology really directs attention very strongly. Those also sometimes require energy too, but it's not that it's actually an energetic requirement. It's just that it's an important enough situation that it's worth reducing attention, and most of the time it's not. And we're just aware that it's sort of weird,
Uh-huh.
that our attention has been narrowed so much. Does that, I don't know if that makes sense as an
No, that
op.
does make sense. To some extent, it's sort of a yeah, going at it from a slightly different angle. But yeah, we're using the same amount of energy. It's just how it's allocated. And most of the time, we're not really aware of how our energy is allocated unless we have this sort of system that is making it more apparent to us.
Mm. I want to throw another hypothesis out. I mean, could it be that um, the restructuring of our neural networks is energy intensive? You
Mhm.
mentioned earlier that stress can affect brain networks and can damage certain neural pathways. Um, could it be that, if I'm in a really important situation that I need to pay really close attention to and remember every single detail of it and
Mhm.
totally revise my plans and strategies and into the future, then I'm going to have to restructure my brain a lot during that moment.
Mhm.
And that itself requires energy. I have to construct new neural networks. I have to take in this information
Mhm.
and store every detail of it so that I can use it later on, and so that I can use it to totally reorient my behavioral strategies going
Mhm.
into the future. And so, could it be that the restructuring of brain networks and the retention of the information and the use of that information to guide long-term behavior is itself energy intensive, and that might explain the link between uh, stress and attention.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And, that's the thing is that we can look at that one way as like, if you think about a stressful situation or maybe, social evaluative, maybe not you don't feel super stressed, but you're, very aroused and, very attentive to the situation. Afterwards, you feel hungrier than you
Hmm.
would have otherwise, right? And so
Yeah.
there is that sort of process of sort of, I expended some calories somehow.
Yeah.
I did something.
Yeah. And I don't, this is all anecdotal, but like, after I'm done teaching, for example, I'll just be like compulsive for an hour, like in a way that if I hadn't been,
Hmm. Hmm.
or just like I feel like I need a break. I just need to
Almost
like
on autopilot.
unwind.
Yeah.
Yeah, like and I don't know what that is, and I don't know if there's like a good account of that. But
Hmm.
I feel like people talk about that a lot, where like, or I didn't realize how stressed I was, but now that I'm coming down, I just need to
Hmm.
relax for a while.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, you can see how people have this like hydraulic model of things, but I mean, clearly there's something to that, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
so yeah, there's still mysteries there in terms of describing sort of what that means at a computational level. Like, why do people have that? It's certainly a real thing at every scale, right? Like, people come out of a super high stressful abusive relationship, and they just like they have to unwind, and they're, like every scale of whether it's teaching for an hour or a year-long stressor or a multi-year stressor or whatever. It's interesting, and I feel like sometimes people poo-poo that hydraulic model thing, but I think there's something to it, but I don't know what would be going on there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do think there's something to it. I don't think we understand it very well. And I think that goes back to, sort of what you mentioned earlier is this mind blindness, right? A lot of
Yeah.
this is happening, on a very implicit level. We really only bring it to explicit awareness when it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Some of this stuff starts to touch on things like, school performance or obesity or discounting the future, sort of things that as citizens or as social institutions sort of train people, we run up against the fact that people have adverse social situations, they get stressed, and then we're dealing with phenotypes that vary in how designed for a stressful environment they are. And I know some of your research has sort of touched on things like social adversity, and obviously it's a big political or social issue, as you would expect, right? Um, can you talk maybe at least or give some flavors of what those some of those areas of research are, or what you've discovered that might be surprising to people or just people who don't know the work?
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that development has any sort of signature on, the adult phenotype. And so just, sort of starting from that perspective is why would we sort of, calibrate our, attentional systems, our stress response systems and things like that in a childhood environment, to something that's going to happen later. And, there's debate in the field about, sort of the predictive value of childhood versus adult environment, in our evolutionary past or even today, and things like that. But one of the things that we found most is that all adversity isn't the same. And so, sort of, I'm talking about, like if you're just in a low resource environment, yes, that's adverse. That's not fun. Nobody wants to be there. But that doesn't leave the same signature on the stress response system as, say, an unpredictable social environment would. And
Mm.
so kids that are coming from, sort of these more, I don't know. I don't want to use a value judgment, but chaotic is a lot of times the term that's used. These homes that are unpredictable. Basically, they maybe parents are unpredictable in their behavior. The resources are unpredictable. Those sorts of things. They seem to show a stress response system that's calibrated to that unpredictability. But what that does is that then pulls back. You mentioned sort of future orientation that pulls that back to be able to develop that as a skill or something that is even worth developing your energy towards, and become much more sort of present focus, reward focus, on what's happening in the immediate.
Yeah, that makes sense given the design of the system. You're basically what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that if the whole point of the stress system is what's currently happening, you're not prepared for. And if the environment is non-stationary, meaning it's moving, constantly moving, you're basically just telling the stress system you're going to have to be active a lot.
Mhm.
It's not rational to expect that the way the environment is today is going to be like, it's obvious I'm saying out loud, but yeah, no, it makes sense that that would be the case. And I guess in a world where, um, if you want to be a good worker in the widget factory and you want to be a good, even just collaborative partner, it's ideal to have somebody whose calibrational settings are at least stable or not discounting the future to the extent that discounting the future means they might be more likely to want to exploit you for good or fair or not fair reasons. Like you can see where social friction arises or value judgments come up from the people who have the luxury of not discounting the future, sort of look down upon discounting the future.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
interesting.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it's making me think of a metaphor of like if you're on a sailboat and there's really tumultuous and unpredictable weather, such that there could be a storm at any time. You're going to want to have all hands on deck,
Mhm.
for most of that time, just in case there's a huge tidal wave or there's a huge storm and you need to, throw water out of the boat, right? But if you can perfectly predict the
Mhm.
weather, even if it's really bad weather, even if you know there's
Yeah,
going to be a storm
right.
at this exact time
Yeah,
for
that's a
three
good point.
hours,
Yeah,
you can just sleep and then you can just be prepared for that storm.
yeah.
And so
Mhm.
it's not really the storms per se
Mm.
that are going to make you have the all hands on deck response.
Mhm.
It's the unpredictability of when the storm is going to come that necessitates the all hands on deck response.
Yeah, that's a fantastic analogy. Really, really great. And one of the things that we see too, and some of my research has shown, is those, individuals from these really unpredictable environments, they don't get stressed over, we can send them through the triosocial stress task, and they don't show any response. And a lot of it is because their systems are calibrated to, at least in our sample, there was a lot of neighborhood violence. There was a lot of, just unpredictability, even in their young adult environment. And so this, yeah, I can come in and, do some math problems for you, no problem. That's not going to really impact my, sort of survivability. Sort of consistent with that, we looked at their diurnal stress response. So we, have an initial stress response in the morning, and then it usually sort of declines throughout the day. With these individuals, it was sort of the opposite, and that they ramped it up towards the end of the day. Initially, when I got that finding, I couldn't really understand what was going on. Right? It was like, again, are their systems just broken? Are they, what are they doing? But if you look at their context, when are the things that are most likely, that are going to be bad for you to happen in the evenings? Right. If you're living in these, sort of more violent neighborhoods, and, things like that, that's when, you need to be, sort of vigilant. You need to be aware. And so, yeah, your analogy with a sailboat is absolutely perfect for that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It also it reminds me of some of the work that Daniel Nettle has done on obesity
Hmm.
and the unpredictability of food.
Hmm.
And what he's argued is that the tendency of the body to store energy in the form of fat for the future is or may be caused by an unpredictability in the available food sources, such that if you're constantly skipping meals or if you're uncertain about where your next meal is going to come from, or if at any moment you could just run out of food, then it becomes a really good bet for you to store energy on your body in the form of fat, just in case food is going to be unavailable or insecure in the future. And so he has run counter to this mismatch story that the reason why we have this obesity problem is because we just can't control ourselves and we shove the Twinkies in our mouth.
Being high
But
calories.
he's
Yeah.
actually argued that there's actually more logic and sophistication to this system, that it's responding to reliable cues of uncertainty and food insecurity, and it's adaptively storing energy on the body for those kinds of ecological contexts. And I'm curious if there is any other research to back that up about the relationship between stress and eating and fat storage and obesity.
Yeah. No, there is. And, also it's very consistent with, future discounting and
Yeah.
things like that. So childhood obesity, we see kids that are more impulsive. They're less able to wait for long-term rewards, those sorts of things. The entire system is sort of calibrated to the here and now. Because later, we'll worry about that later, right?
Yeah.
You need to survive this moment, in particular. And, you can even draw from, like the studies with the Dutch hunger winter, and things like that. So those, mothers when they were pregnant experienced, malnutrition, a lot of unpredictability, and things like that. And they followed them afterwards. And those kids were more prone to developing obesity, more prone to developing heart issues,
Mm.
and those sorts of things because the signal that they got was, there's not enough food. And
Yeah.
you need to, really down regulate your metabolism, in order to take advantage of the calories that you do receive.
Mm. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing too, and this comes up. This is back to the magic point where the fact that our endocrine system interacts with our brain is really interesting. I mean, again, it's sort of stupid that I think that's interesting, but it is because somehow our brains know how resources are unpredictable, right? Or, I mean, so for example, you might
Sure.
say, well, like maybe, how often am I hungry? That feels like a very physiological thing. But there's a lot of things like social cues. There's probably a lot of cues of like how often do I see food? And if you don't believe that, well, like look at all the social reactions. Like, you're not getting punched a lot, and even if you are, like it matters whether or not somebody was like intending it or not. But a
Hmm.
lot of things are just very abstract social or information processing cues of like
Hmm.
what's the level of violence or conflict. Um, and somehow this is having an effect not only in our brains, but also the rest of our body. It's a really fascinating idea that very abstract cues can have a very concrete, even developmental or kind of calibrational effect on us, like how much we're likely to store fat, for
Right.
example.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and that's, I think, reflects the fact that we don't really, not only do we not understand the brain as well as we think we do, but we particularly don't understand development and the
Mm.
developing brain like we think we do, or as much as we think we do. Kids are, encoding much more information than we give them credit for.
Yeah. This is something I just bring it back to stress for a second. Have you thought about stress differently because of this work? So, for example, like if somebody's listening and they're like, well, how can I help my kids be less stressed? Or like if somebody I care about is stressed, is there a reaction that's sort of a better thing to do, a worse thing to do? Does it really depend on what the stressor is? Because I know like that's always, we don't want our kids to be stressed, but then as you said, we want them to build the muscles of dealing with that. Do you think differently about stress, or like, does anybody ever ask you for like, advice, maybe quote unquote, or like how to approach stress among people we care about?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I get that question a lot. And I think, a lot of it really depends on what the stressor is, and then also, what, potential impact and we can talk about how good we are at sort of forecasting this, but what potential impact that might have, on the individual. As well, I think, just taking kids, for example, a lot of, parents want to protect them from any sort of adversity, right? Or any sort of negative outcome. And, I could take, homework as an example of that. Like, parents sometimes will, make sure that their kids do their, homework or if they didn't turn it in, oh, can they turn it in, for a grade now, and that sort of thing. I had with my oldest son, his teacher was actually shocked at a parent-teacher conference because I told her, I said, I want you to fail him. He didn't turn this stuff in, so fail him because otherwise you don't ever learn to sort of
Yeah.
mobilize those resources
Yeah.
to be able to, sort of make that happen. And then they become college students that ask for extensions and, those sorts of things. But on sort of a bigger level and particularly now it's really difficult I think for parents to understand or to know what is a threat versus what isn't a threat, right? And that's what a lot of parents make the mistake of sort of like not letting their kids play outside, not letting them sort of experience some of these things on their own, and having to deal with challenges of how do I cross the creek or those sorts of things, or how do I stay away from people that might be dangerous or situations that might be dangerous. And so they keep them inside. Well, what are they doing inside? They're going on the internet and they're getting all sorts of, things that they shouldn't be exposed to and, that sort of thing. But parents perceive that as, being safer and that sort of thing. So perception is a big, component to this, a big key to it. But I think, sort of with other relationships, that you might care about, I think it really depends a lot on, the particular stressor. But what people are looking for is a coping mechanism, right? Of how do I feel better about this? How do I solve this, particular problem? And to the extent that you can form an allyship or, whatever, and sort of helping them out, I think would be better about that. But like you mentioned before, it's difficult to sort of, particularly in this day and age, to determine what should I be stressed about. So for example, should we be worried about, how much our colleagues are making, right? There's people that will go in and look at, salaries and things like that. I would recommend no. Than not being something. But what that's reflecting is that's reflecting a motivation towards, towards status driving. And so if you could redirect that in a way that is, more controllable,
Mm.
then you're going to see the stress response system damp down.
Mm. So part of it is that the status, or not, yeah, well, status is the example, but the stress system, in addition to our current situation, it's also a function of what the plans and goals are. So the same situation might not be stressful to one person versus another because of where their mental representations of where they're trying to get to are.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we're about getting to that time in the episode where we ask our canonical question, which is there anything that we should have asked you or that we should have talked about that we have missed?
Hmm. Let me think about that for a second.
Yeah,
No.
Sorry to
like
stress you
yeah,
out.
yeah, no, no, because yeah, I know, because there's lots of like specific studies you've done
Mm,
too that we haven't really talked about. But I mean, people can look on your website too. But
yeah.
yeah, if there's anything, or yeah, any question at all, or anything that you're either currently working on or really, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think most of my current work, I have, a couple different areas. And one thing that I think that people don't know enough about, or I don't know enough about, we don't know enough about as a field, is, so I got into sex differences, talking, understanding sex differences sort of through this stress response system interest and that sort of thing, but also an interest about parenting and fatherhood.
yeah.
So I think that that's, sort of an area that people we don't know enough about. We don't know enough about, how fathers uniquely impact kids' development. And one of the ways that we think that may be happening is actually through dads are more likely to, for example, do rough and tumble play with their kids and, things like that. That's sort of it's a low level, but it's a risk. And it's allowing kids to sort of, get experience with, sort of getting really aroused and coming right to that edge of aggression and pulling back
Hmm.
and those sorts of things. And so just, sort of building from that, I don't think that we know enough about that. And I wish more researchers would sort of, get in line with sort of understanding what is going on with human fatherhood. Why are dads even investing at all? And I realize there's a lot of, there's variability in that investment. But why are you spending all your energy that way? Not even, why are you not, seeking more mates? But just, why are you not just, spending your energy making more money or, having more fun doing things? Why are we motivated in that way? So yeah, that's, one area that I'm sort of dabbling in. But interestingly, it's really difficult to get dads to participate in research.
Mm,
Even though we know that they're doing all of these things,
Mhm.
we can't quite, sort of get it on an observational level. So
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, you're preaching to the choir as you're talking to two dads
Mhm.
of young kids right now. And yeah, no, parenting psychology and dad
Yeah.
psychology, that's fantastic. We should do like a special issue in EHB or something, just even if it's,
Yeah,
Great.
totally. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I'm curious what you think about a change I noticed in myself after becoming a dad.
Mhm.
I am now, after becoming a dad, much more likely to cry during movies. Like movies that I saw before. Like I remember I saw Moana before becoming a dad, and then after, and I did not, have much of an emotional response when I first saw it. And then after becoming a dad, I was like bawling during the entire movie, like,
Mhm. Yep. Your
and
child changed your brain.
yeah, it changed my brain.
Mhm.
It's weird. I don't know how to explain like why crying during movies. I don't know what that's about, but it's an interesting response I've noticed in
Right.
myself.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that reflects, just more empathetic sensitivity.
yeah.
And, you guys know this. And when I tell my college students this, they get very upset and worried about it as, when you're a father, when you become a father, if you are investing, you experience a little decline in testosterone, right? So testosterone is negatively associated with empathy.
Mhm.
And so it's probably, an adaptive calibration there to become more sensitive to these social cues, particularly, this individual that you're should be really highly invested in.
Mhm.
You can tell them that it's fantastic to experience a decrease in testosterone. As somebody who I feel like I had an excess of testosterone and I was like miserable, like
Uh-huh.
crawling out of my skin, and I had a kid, and I'm like, this is awesome. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm
I'm
very
Yeah.
glad to
relaxed.
have less
Yeah.
testosterone in
Yeah.
my
No, for
system.
yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's
Uh,
a parenting, the parenting and the what dads are doing. And we've had some people on like Karen Kramer or Sheena Lou Levy, this idea that this second or third wave evolutionary approach to even though we have to reproduction is important, the idea that investment in the social and physical capital of offspring really makes a big difference on their success and their status, right? Like we don't question the idea that investing in my own generation's resources and status is good fitness from a fitness perspective. But there used to be sort of this cartoonish idea that, well, if we just have kids,
Mhm.
then that's all that matters. And like the number of kids is all that matters. But if you just follow the logic for yourself, then it matters how many resources your kids have. It matters what their social status is. It's just
Right.
as much of an arms race their generation as it was for yours. And
Right.
if you just accept that consistent logic, then it immediately becomes a thing of, yeah, you're not going to just necessarily always just invest in mating or maximizing the number of offspring. There's also what's the level of investment in that in the next generation
Right.
because they're in an arms race just as much as you are. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and what's going to pay off, right?
Yeah.
And paying off is on, really developing, socio-competitive competencies in your kid because their status is going to impact, future generations as well.
Yeah, I've always felt as a coalition slash alliance researcher myself, I've always thought that the time course of alliances and the fact that you as an adult currently your alliance structure will fundamentally may or may not survive the future because there's new
Right. There's new
the
groups
kids
coming
are
in.
going to grow up.
Hmm.
I've always thought that was also underemphasized that
Hmm.
there must be a psychology of worrying about that,
Hmm.
of wanting to affect that, and I think
Hmm.
that's also something that hasn't been as emphasized as it needs to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think history, people, just a stupid aside, but like I always wonder like why we teach history the way we do and when we do, because
Hmm.
I don't know about you guys, but I feel much more interested in history the older I get. But I was taught history very early, and I actually wonder if it's a readout of like the evolved psychology being like we have to indoctrinate the
Yeah.
kids early to our history, and it's the expression of wanting our current
yeah.
social
Hmm.
narrative to extend. And it's probably not well designed for what kids actually are interested in.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, there's a huge demand for, teaching kids the values that the parents hold. Like I see so many children's books that are, preaching these political messages. And, I agree with the political message, but still I find it interesting that there's such a
yes,
demand
Right.
for, inculcating kids into these values at such a young age. I think it does speak to this adaptive problem of ensuring that the kids don't grow up to,
yeah,
shake up the political alliance structure
yeah.
Hmm.
that was built.
Yeah,
Right. Right.
it's some
Absolutely.
of it's pretty explicit. Like I've
Yeah.
seen like I grew up in a religious background. I remember looking, this was years ago, like for example, like people staying in a religion, like it's very explicit and well known that if you
Yeah.
don't get kids early,
Hmm.
they don't stay in it or get in it at all. Like there's very
Yeah.
much an age time course. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jen, thank you so much for coming on. It was a
Yeah.
pleasure. I feel like
Thanks for inviting me.
it was the perfect combination of, I feel like I am a clearer thinker about really important fundamental things, but it also is opening up a whole bunch of mysteries and questions. But I think that's the lovely beauty of taking an evolutionary perspective is it's sort of the things we take for granted are actually strange, and we just get
Uh,
clarity on that.
right. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
David, this was not a stressful episode at all.
No, in fact, it was quite relaxing and enjoyable.
Yeah, agreed. If you feel the same, then please like and subscribe, social media, Patreon. And David, I just want to reiterate how lovely the music is for this podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's very sweet to hear.
Yeah. Can you remind me, how do you do it again? Do you use you don't keyboard or no keyboard?
Mouse. So I use Logic Pro,
Okay.
and you can just click a note and then drag it up or down to raise or
Amazing.
lower the pitch. And I copy and paste the notes and put them where I want. And yeah,
Amazing.
yeah, it's a lot of
It's
fun.
That's cool. Being a composer on your computer it's wonderful. It's, yeah.
It is wonderful. I also play the guitar a bit,
Hmm.
but yeah,
What kind of guitar do you have?
I have an acoustic guitar,
Hmm.
mainly because I used to have an electric guitar and it was too annoying for my wife to play. But she likes the
Headphones.
sound of acoustic guitar, and yeah,
Headphones. You can plug in.
yeah, that's.
What kind of acoustic guitar do you have?
Well, here, let me show you. It's right
Oh,
here.
it's right here. I didn't even know. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, it's beautiful. What
Like,
brand is it? Is it
I have
Fender?
I have no idea.
It
I'm not
looks
a
like a
guitar.
Fender.
Could
Look in
Yeah, it
the
is a
whole
Fender. You're
sound
right.
hall. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yep, it's a Fender. Yeah, I'm not a guitar person. I don't know a lot about guitars, but I just enjoy playing them.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, great. Well, maybe next week, maybe next outro, we can get a little bit of David on the acoustic guitar, or maybe bonus episode.
Ooh, yeah. I mean, maybe we'll do that if if we get a lot of support from our listeners.
Oh,
Like if we,
nice.
yeah, that'll be a nice incentive for you
Okay.
guys.
Well, we have to do our homework and think about what incentive to dangle in front of listeners.
Yeah,
And
live
then,
performance
yeah,
of David
and then,
Pinzoff on the
yes.
guitar.
Oh, I like this song. Oh, wow. This is amazing.
Yeah, I'll write a song about whatever you want. How's that for an incentive?
Well, now we have to think about, when we have the incentive down, now we have to think about what we want from people.
Well, you can give us some money on Patreon. You can say some nice things about us on social media. Leave us a kind review. I think that's about it, right?
That is, but it's pretty vague. Like you have to, like, if somebody's like, well, what do I have to do personally to be able to be the one to tell David, here's what the song should be. Like, donate this amount of money, or like, get this. Don't we have to have a
How about
specific
this?
incentive? Yeah.
After your kind review, after your kind words on social media, after your Patreon donation, just say, this one's for you, David. I want that song.
Sounds good. All right. For
Yeah.
whoever gets to that first. Okay. All right. Interesting. Okay, good. I like this direction. Okay. And this is how we become a bluegrass band. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Everybody have a good week, and we'll see you with Charles Darwin. Okay. Uh,
With the AI ghost of Charles Darwin.
throwback to
We should get an AI to like, read all of Charles Darwin's works and just be Charles Darwin and then just interview him on the podcast.
that is weird.
That would be pretty bizarre to do, actually, but it might be
Yeah.
interesting. I don't
I
know.
feel ambivalently about that. I don't know.
It's
That's
kind
a
of
good,
creepy.
it's an idea. I
Yeah.
feel really, yeah, I feel
I'm
that's a little
confident that it is an idea.
That's a little stressful, actually. Okay. All right. Uh, okay, David. I'll see you next week, and maybe we'll have Charles Darwin and you on the guitar next week.
Maybe he'll accompany me on my
On
song.
the steel
The
guitar,
AI
for
version
whatever
of
reason,
Darwin will be
I
singing
have
alongside
Darwin on
me.
the steel guitar for some reason. I don't know why. Um,
All right.
all right, everybody. Have a good week. All
Have a good week.
right.